of the amount of British territories that we were trying to get a title to. People sitting around listening to the lawyers drip, moan on, ditto, another young woman, an older woman. You get the general picture. This is a plate that I had made in forward of it to Highgate to demonstrate the success of the water mitigation. This borehole celebrates the struggle of the people of the CKG office while right to their ancestral land. These are hunters. We met them as we came back out of the bush, having unsuccessfully tried to find an eland, which someone told us they'd just killed. You can see his spear on the right. He's got a club in his hand, which he uses to club the animal once it's down. There's a boy and a donkey behind him. The donkey used to carry the game back when they find something. Here's his friend with him. He also has a spear in his left hand. Two dogs below them. The dogs are used to vary the hensblock or hartebeest or whatever it is. They will clamber up on them and bite them if they get a chance. It's a war of attrition, I'm afraid, in which usually the bushman is the loser. The success of these hunting expeditions is pretty low. They are much more dependent upon harvesting bushwood, build products, call it what you will. All manner of tubers, roots, melons, roots, berries, everything. That makes up about 60% of the diet. 30% diet again, and even of that 30%, the men only get probably half. The women trap animals more successfully. Smaller animals like steamboat, that kind of thing. But the men go after the bigger animals, and of course, if they get something, which occasionally they do, the whole settlement can feast for a week. There he is. Old woman watching and listening. This young man has just come back from Hoping, 2-day journey on a donkey, where he has been to see his, I think his uncle, or father, I can't remember which. Again, a very typical picture of the settlement. Usually 10 or 12 huts, surrounded, as you can see, by a stockade. You see it, just about. To stop lions, which do sometimes get in. And that's a fairly typical picture of the reserve as it is in the rainy season. You can see that it's green because the rains did come. In summer, it's much less green, it's dry, and it is pretty inhospitable. So that's that. What else? In a few minutes left in me, I ought to say something about this is under trial. We went into the reserve first with 3 judges and a cavalcade of court officials. We sped through the reserve at death-defying speeds in brand new 4x4 Toyotas, most of which never survived the journey. Their suspensions were cruelly broken by the trip, went far too fast. In the course of that visit, we learned that the government had just introduced an amendment to the Constitution to withdraw the provision which had protected the Central Kalahari from challenge. Sidney was interviewed about this by a television reporter inside the reserve and was astonished at the suggestion that this had been done in order to undercut the Bushman's case. Good heavens, no. It was purely coincidental, he said, that they had made the decision to amend the Constitution at the same time as the court proceedings began. We went to Montmello, where there was a borehole, one built by De Beers. I noticed that the borehole was capped. There was an iron cap on the top, and I asked why it had been capped, knowing that the reason was they wanted to stop the residents who were by now come back into the reserve from getting at the water. The District Commissioner thought this was not an appropriate answer to give, so he suggested that it had been capped in order to stop the children throwing stones down the pipe. Some judicial eyebrows were raised at that answer. So the trial itself continued. I can just say, before we finish, One issue that was of some interest, at least to me, was compensation. The Bushmen were compensated for the loss of their kraals, their huts, their crops. We knew nothing about this until Sidney began his efforts. We hadn't been told before, it wasn't in the academics, so we hadn't asked any questions of our own clients about this. And I protested, therefore, that Sidney should not be allowed to use this argument so late in the day. My arguments were rejected and the evidence was given. I said, well, if there is compensation paid, there must be documents to show that the compensation paid. Sidney said, well, yes, but it's irrelevant because we're not concerned with the amount, we're concerned with the fact that they agreed to go on payment of compensation. I persisted, and I was told that there were documents, they were in the basement in the hands of the City Council, 400 miles up the Trans-Gallagher Highway. I was welcome to go look at them if I wanted. No, I wasn't going to do that. And eventually the court said they must be brought to a bouncer. They were. And Carl, Mercy and I spent an entire weekend going through the boxes. Some of them still had sand in them. They clearly hadn't been used or looked at for several years. We didn't know what we were looking for. We tried every single way to find help from them. And finally, and belatedly, it occurred to me that we should compare the documents we had in front of us with the list of applicants that we had prepared for other purposes during the course of the trial. We did that. And we discovered that only those applicants who were men appeared on the compensation forms. The applicants who were women did not. And I knew, because of conversations I've had, that in Botswana customary law, married women cannot own property. It all belongs to the man. So the officials who'd gone into the reserve to fill in the compensation forms assumed that only the men needed to be consulted, only the men needed to sign the form, and they'd done it with a cross and prison. So we said, well, what about women? And in cross-examination it became apparent that the witnesses, the government officials, had not asked the women whether they laid any claim to any of the property for which compensation was being paid, and the government was persuaded that therefore that argument fell flat. And we were back to the basic tenet, which was that there was something in Botswana as native title, and we had been eroded and violated by the government, and we ought therefore to be allowed to return to the reserve. We were successful, and we went back. After that decision, I should say just one last point. Before I'd gone to that final hearing in 2006, my wife, for reasons I never have been able to understand, said I ought to get myself some hearing aids. She thought I was deaf. How ridiculous. Anyway, I got the hearing aids, and I was grounded, unfortunately, as we went back into the reserve to tell people about the successful hearing in the Susanna case. I say unfortunately because I had not known when we went in that the Bushmen or Bushwomen have a particular custom, which is that if they think someone has done well, if they think someone deserved to be congratulated, they blow into their ear. Most Bushman women are about 5 foot tall. I'm 6'3". I had to bend down in order for them to blow into my ear. One old woman was particularly enthusiastic and blew very vigorously into my ear, at which point, so the Bushman thought, a piece of my brain and landed some yards away in the desert sands. They were concerned, perhaps this was the part of my brain in which resided all my knowledge of Botswana law and regulations. No, baby. But fortunately, thousands of years of practice had given them the skill of finding NHS hearing aids in the desert sands. And with a matter of a couple of hours or so, my hearing aid had been rescued and returned to the receptacle to which it belonged. So all was well with ends well. And thank you very much for listening to me.
Thank you so much for a wonderful talk. Do we have time for a few questions?
Thank you very much, and thank you for an interesting talk. Two quick questions, if I may. The first is that when I was an anthropology student about 50 years ago, it was conventional to refer to the Bushmen as the San, S-A-N, or sometimes S-A-A-N. And indeed, as I recall, use of the term Bushman at that time was seen as rather insulting. It was sort of deriding their primitiveness.
Yes.
Now, I don't hear the word San much these days, and I know with interest that you call them Bushmen all the way through your talk. So, has that changed? And if so, is that because San was found to refer only to some of the tribes or what? And then the second question I made is that for 30 or 40 years now, all over Africa, when wildlife or game reserves are set up, in order to try to confront the resentment that local people often feel about losing their land or their livelihood, serious attempts are made to involve the community in the management of the park and of the wildlife. Was that tried in the Kalahari case? Were the San or the Bushmen given any opportunity to be involved in the caring of the environment? Thank you.
As to the first point, the people of the reserve don't really call themselves either San or Basara or Bushmen. And Basara and San are thought to be derogatory, as is Bushman by some people, because Basara, for example, means without cattle. They don't have cattle, they don't understand cattle. San is also thought to be derogatory. So I use Bushman, I suppose, because of some rather pathetic colonial affectation, and because when I call them Bushmen to their names, they don't seem to be too upset. As to community management, that is a very important point, and it's true that management structures of one description or another, and there are many descriptions, have been tried both in Africa and in South America and elsewhere, particularly in Australia, actually, over the course of the last 20 years. Has it been tried in Botswana? No, it hasn't. Should it be tried? Yes, it should. And I have put forward proposals to the government which would involve the grant of an absolute title to a large chunk of the CKGR to the Bushmen, but in return they would agree to the creation of a private game reserve in which management would be either shared with the Department of Wildlife or done solely to the Bushmen if after a period of time they are sufficiently well equipped to deal with it. The problem has always been that you've got illiterate, inexperienced indigenous people who don't understand how communities work, they don't know what minutes of meetings are, they don't know how to make decisions in a European way. And on the other hand, you've got wildlife people who know how to manipulate the situation, and that's true of conservation society organisers as well as everybody else. So you have to come up with a very carefully constructed structure, but yes, it should be done.
You mentioned in your talk that the children go off to school. Do they come back to stay in the reserve, or is this going to be something that means that gradually the Bushmen will just slowly wither away?
Well, I think that's a very interesting question to which I don't know the answer. At the moment, everybody goes to school in County or Carolina. Some come back, some don't. Those who come back may leave. We met in Genoa, for example, a young man who said, it's hard work hunting. It takes a long time. I spend much of my time hungry and tired and exhausted. I've had enough. I want to go and find a new life somewhere else. So they may do that. The problem is, and it's a kind of self-fulfilling cycle in a way, the problem is that there is still rampant prejudice against the Bushmen in Botswana society. They are thought to be primitive, they are thought to be illiterate. Some of them, those who are educated, can possibly make their way, but they start from a position of
disadvantaged. I think over time, some will leave and some will stay, and some will come back after a period away.
Margaret, there's a lady there with a
Thank you. You showed a number of photographs of very, very old people in their 90s. And I just wondered, do they have great longevity living like that? Or how do they preserve their health, or are these exceptional people?
Well, that's a good question. My daughter was a consultant at Whittington, and I had hoped she'd come with me in January. She could give me the answer. I can't. She couldn't come because she has a 2-year-old child who wouldn't have survived probably the onslaught of reservoir weather. Dr. Livingston took his children from Kalahari. They never forgave him for the experience. The first point is that people eat, when they eat at all, good food. They are eating game, they are eating about 80 different varieties of tuber, roots, berries and so on. So they have a good diet and they are physically vigorous most of their lives. Most of the older women do go out on garden trips. They may be out all day. Sometimes, although much less so now than used to be the case, they will go on the summer camp and they'll be out in the bush for several days at a time. So they are fit. And I'm not sure just how typical it is to grow very old. I suspect not all that typical. Some die because, of course, they get diseases and there are no doctors to help them. And they could have been saved that aren't. So I think it's a bit of a mixed bag, really. Some survive into great old age. One woman was 100. Many just received a telephone call. So, so I think some do and some don't is the answer. And I should say you can't receive people in a pretty desperate state, even although they are not all that old. Our problem seems to be particularly endemic, I don't know why.
Margaret, there's a lady here in the front row. Is anyone over there? This lady here. Actually, wait for the microphone.
This is about Bushmen children and education. I have a great friend who's an anthropologist working in Namibia. There's a Bushman there. She spent her entire working life among them, speaks the language. And because of the change in the situation in Namibia, with representation of all peoples in the government, she fought very hard to make sure that the Bushmen had representation in the parliament. And this was difficult because, as you say, the Bushmen do things by collective decision, and they do not have leaders, and they do not want leaders. And she confronted the problem over many years, talking about this is the future for your survival. You need to be able to cope with the structures of government, and you have to have a representative to do so. That also means literacy. So she first of all began, so she's a fluent German speaker, she first began to write school books in their language, so they began to read in their language. Her name is Megan Beasley, I think you may have heard of her. And then after that, translated into the various languages they would need for parliament. And so far that has worked. Bushmen are always considered to be vermin, pointers. They're really looked down upon by all the African tribes. And there's no way out of that. It goes on forever. But, all right, it's just that she started this so that there would be a certain category of Bushmen who would be able to cope, not descended to alcoholism, would be able to cope with the modern world and fight for fairness.
Yes.
Right. I think we should. Anything else? Anybody else want to raise a point? There's one more point here, and then we'll close this with this
I
thing.
have to say this is rarely taken
about the time you're talking about, I was sent up to have a holiday in the Latvia with my uncle, so I was broken now. And a lot of the things you said ran off the bells of me. He was working for the British government in whichever department was involved in teaching African tribes, particularly the Bushmen, to separate their animals from wild animals because of foot and mouth disease. And he lived in the Batsy. One of the things that happened in the Batsy was my aunt said, tomorrow we're going to make marmalade. There's an empty plot next door and it's absolutely covered in tangerines. Right, next morning we got up, there was not a tangerine on the tree, there was some peeled thing on the bottom. A crowd of baboons had come down in the night. All the big things. Anyway, during this period on a Sunday, there was what I thought was going to be some sort of a fair in the desert. Because we were talking about races and picnics in the sky. So we went along, and there were races. They were not quite what I expected. The Bushmen were on one side, and I think the grippers, wasn't it, who were on the other side, and they were two competing sides. And the grippers complained all the time that the Bushmen were cheating. And the Bushmen used to get bored after being ticked off of it and clear off in the middle of races and things. All kinds of stuff like this. One loss was about education. I had two small daughters. We went to the local school until the age of about 12 or so, when it was decided the education wasn't good enough. And so they were sent down to the convent in South Africa, which was in Bloemfontein or Hungary, on South Africa. They went down and back by themselves on the train, but they had a special guard, which you had to book, but there was no fee for this, who protected them because they were two little white girls. Seems very strange.
Thank you so much for your contribution. If any of you have any other contributions to make about your experiences of Bushmen and Africa, you can come and talk to Gordon Bennett when we finish the fall part of this talk. I would like to thank you for a really interesting talk and all the amazing stuff you did for the Bushmen, and I hope you really helped them to survive in their way of life.